And Derek, don't ever click on advanced permissions in that modern permissions panel. If you follow these rules, you don't have to click on advanced permissions. And in fact, you shouldn't.
All right, people, it's October 30th, and we're going to kick off. Today, we have all of our Sympraxians in the house, and so we will get started on today's session, which is themed The Many Faces of Permissions in Microsoft 365. And I feel like this is going to be a good one, since our conversation on Monday was really bifurcated, like, wow, okay, we can do that. Oh, we didn't, so bringing it all together not only is going to help all of you, hopefully, but it's going to help all of us, because we had different viewpoints on a lot of things. So checking where things stood and whatever was definitely a big part of our Monday. So hopefully we've got everything pulled together. Okay, so we're going to talk about our permission philosophy as an organization. So Sympraxis' sort of permission philosophy. We're going to talk about modern versus classic permissions, public versus private. We're going to go into policies, a lot into policies, because I think that's where the big confusion can lie. So we have policies for sharing, the SP admin sharing, the sharing settings at the site, and then to just add insult to injury, SharePoint Premium adds some more permissions, sharing, restricted access, blah, blah, blah. And so we'll wrap up around there. All right, so we have a lot of content, so we're going to get started.
I
Mark?
looked quickly, Julie, and I thought that
yes.
you had changed it to policy shaming.
Oh, right, I forgot. Policy shaming, right, correct.
No, that's this slide. This slide is policy shaming on Derek.
This is, policy shaming on Derek. Right. Mark?
Yes.
Shame Derek.
Yes, so that thing on the bottom is for Derek, and I'm just going to remind him about it when I'm done. All right, so permissions, basically, as with many things, simple is good. Try and keep your permissions as simple as you possibly can. And that's part of our philosophy here. So we try in all cases to set permissions on the site level and then not break in any inheritance going down. Now that's sort of against the way we've historically used SharePoint, but we find that that really solves a lot of the problems we have with permissions. I think one of the reasons for that is we didn't historically necessarily think about a site as a unit of work. Like, for example, we might have had a site for all IT projects. Well, that's a whole bunch of stuff that happens over a long period of time instead of a site for IT project 1, IT project 2, a different site, because the composition of that unit of work changes over time. So don't be afraid of making sites that have different units of work, because then your permissions get much simpler. If you have exceptions to that rule of setting permissions on the site level, really think about them hard. Because, for example, if your IT project is a site and you find yourself sharing stuff on a regular basis, maybe that should be stored somewhere else. In other words, you might want to publish that stuff in another location for the group that should have access to that. So it really has an impact on how you think about your site topology. Lots of times people worry about site sprawl. What I worry about is not having enough sites to represent the units of work that matter.
I think this is also comes a little bit from the on-prem days when Todd is just, I could see it on the tip of your tongue, Todd. You're like, can we talk about the fact that a new site was in SQL was like a really big deal? Yeah. And I think SharePoint admins were like, I don't want another site. Like, no, we have one site collection. Todd, go ahead and keep going on this subject.
Well, and the management was tough. It was scary on-prem to have, 100 site collections, because it was just tough to manage and wrap your heads around. And the other thing is we had this crutch, we had subwebs. They were just so easy,
Yep.
and end users could make them. So yeah, I definitely think, to Mark's point, we didn't think about things the same way back then, and some of that's just kind of been pulled through, either because you've been doing SharePoint as long as we have, or because you got something migrated and they just did a lift and shift and took the on-prem architecture and dropped it into online. So yeah, I definitely think, yeah, these days I'm with Mark. The more sites, the better. If somebody's like, well, we've only got 3 or 4 sites, I'm like, ooh, that's a bad thing.
Now, from an information architecture perspective, of course, you've got naming conventions and namespaces and all that sort of stuff that become a problem. But from a permissions perspective, this is the philosophy, right? And you have to balance it with all the other stuff. But we're talking about permissions today. Microsoft 365 groups are membership objects. So if you have a team called IT team, or sorry, a Microsoft 365 group called IT team, the only people who should be in that group are people who are members of the IT team. That sounds so simple, but we see people breaking that rule all the time. People get added as members constantly just so that they can access something for a little while. Those groups are membership objects, and you want to be able to rely on them and use them in other places. So for example, if the IT team should have access to all of those IT project sites, you want to make sure that that membership of that group represents the IT team. So you want to populate them carefully, make sure that only the people who understand that have ownership rights to change the membership, and then reuse them so that you can represent that chunk of people. Finally, sharing links can break permission inheritance. It depends on which setting you pick, and it depends on how you're doing it and at what level. So you want to educate your users about how sharing links work, because that they can get you into all kinds of problems when it comes to Copilot and search and all kinds of stuff like that. And we'll talk more about that later. And Derek, don't ever click on advanced permissions in that modern permissions panel. If you can, if you follow these rules, you don't have to click on advanced permissions. And in fact, you shouldn't.
I think it's completely fine to go add your site collection admins that way instead of navigating all the way back around. So Derek gets a small pass.
So that was my use case. That was my use case. I needed to.
But you're never living it down.
Something. No,
you're
I'm
never
not.
living it down.
And I'm showing Mark something, and I go do click advanced, and Mark's like, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't ever do that. Oh.
But it's if you find yourself clicking on advanced permissions and you're not changing the site collection administrators, ask yourself why you're doing that. That's really the bottom line here, even though it's at Derek's expense.
Because I'm old and patterns are hard.
No, you're not old. I'm old. And I told you.
He's right. And I'm older too, so nice try.
Okay, come on. Right. 3 months is not a lot.
True. All right, Mark, continue with the modern versus classic.
Oh yeah, this is sort of the screenshot of the thing that we're talking about. So stick to using modern permissions, right? It's the top half of that, or top 2/3 of that permissions panel that pops out. Only add people to the groups if they actually are part of that group. I already said that, but it's worth reiterating. And then only use classic permissions to clean up messes. Or, Caleb's given another exception when you're dealing with an organizational assets library. Fair point. But you really want to think about whether you need to click on that advanced permission settings. One of the main reasons I go in there, yes, I do click on it occasionally, is to find all the places that inheritance is broken. I can also run a report in ShareGate. We love ShareGate. But it's a way to go and clean up that mess for the times that it's gone off the rails. But other than that, you want to try and stick to modern permissions as much as you can.
Right, 100%. Okay, so now we enter the realm of public versus private, which is sort of, all the grouping has sort of created this situation. So, Mark.
Yeah, so I don't think a lot of people realize what happens when you create a public team or a public group. What actually happens is that public thing, it's a Microsoft 365 group, gets everyone except external users added to the site members. And that means everybody can make changes in that site. Now, there are times when that makes sense, but that's usually the exception. Most team sites are private because it's a small group of people doing some stuff that is either should be shielded from everyone else, or it's just in the way if everyone sees it. So make sure that you choose public versus private carefully. Down at the bottom, I've captured some places where you can see what kind of site or group you have. There's the SharePoint Admin Center. In a team site, you can actually see public group and it doesn't say private group if it's private. And then, of course, in Microsoft Teams, you can see that only because I named the team private team and I named the other team public team, can you tell that it's a public or a private team. So in Teams, you actually can't tell. So be careful with that. You can change that setting after creation. So, if you realize you've made a mistake, you can fix it. But that has a huge difference in permissioning for those containers, those sites, those groups.
Yes, very good thing to know the difference of, especially with that broad everyone except external users group, which is useful, but broad. All right, Derek, moving on over to you. We have lots of sharing or shaming settings.
All the above. So this is really where we all started collectively like pulling on the thread on the sweater. And we started here at the tenant level. So there are sharing settings at the tenant level. And essentially this is just a toggle that says, do you allow guest users in the organization and do you not? Essentially you get there through the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. It's buried under org settings, then under sharing, and then there's a little pivot bar navigation that says security and privacy. Now, I actually had to call Mark to find out where this was because he saw it, and then I tried to find it in my own tenant, and I was like, where the hell is this? So it is hidden. There are additional service level settings specifically for SharePoint and Microsoft 365 groups at the tenant level as well. And one thing I want to point out at this is that especially if you have the box checked or to allow guest users, and guest users are allowed in your tenant, unchecking that box does not remove any existing guest users.
Yeah.
So especially when we start getting to sharing and permissioning, which we're going to get into in the next couple of slides, that comes into play here. So at any rate, allowing external users essentially just says whether or not you can or cannot add those users to your site. I'm going to go to the next one. Now, keeping going on this theme, at the tenant level, we have in our SharePoint Admin Center, in the SharePoint Admin Center, and this is where we all started like getting crazy, they're under policies and sharing. These set the sharing settings for SharePoint and OneDrive. Todd.
From the top down.
Exactly, from the top down. So the image on the left, those are the default sharing limits for SharePoint and OneDrive. And from the most permissive, most open, anybody can open anything and it doesn't require a sign-in. That's pretty scary. Down to only people you're in an organization, no external sharing. And so you can dial those two things up and down. There are also some additional limitations and restrictions. So say you only want to allow external sharing with a certain domain. Maybe you have a design vendor, or maybe you have, a help desk and they have separate email addresses and they come in as an external user. That's the kind of thing that you could do, and you could set it up to sort of put on the allow list very specific domains. You could also do the same thing for certain security groups. So say it's only the IT group that can share externally. And this one was a little scary for me, the one that's checked by default. Allow guests to share items that they don't own, which I had never noticed before. And, sometimes when you poke around things, you find things you didn't know.
Own,
If you own, yes. So
Yeah, but-
exactly. So
meaning,
a guest user, if they created a document or they were viewing a document, they didn't own it, they can then go and share something based on the other settings that we have, which is a little cray-cray to me. So I would uncheck that personally. On the right-hand side, these are very specific to files and folders. I think, who and how the links are shared. So can you share it with specific people, only user, any individual user, only people in your organization, or anyone with the link? Again, things like anyone with the link start to scare me. So generally I would set this to only people in your organization, as well as the default type of permission. So when you get the sharing dialog box, by default, will they get view permissions or will they get edit permissions? Yeah. And so if you want to move on, because we've got a lot.
Yep. So now we're at
Yes.
a SharePoint Admin Center for the site, not for
Yes.
SharePoint all up. So we're at the third level of hell, third ring of
Yes.
hell, essentially.
Yeah. So as Julie was saying, like those were all specific to the tenant, right? These are specific to the individual sites. So again, in SharePoint Admin, you can navigate to your active sites, select the site that you want, and then this little dialog box pops up on the right-hand side, and there's a settings tab. This is going to let you set on a site-by-site basis the different settings for sharing internally, externally. One thing to keep in mind here is that none of this can supersede what was set at the tenant level. So if you did not allow for external users, you can't share the anyone with a link here. They'll just get a 404 error. Now, the sort of more advanced settings are really hidden. So on that settings screen, there's a little drop down that's under external file sharing. It says more sharing settings. And so it's like buried. And once you open that up, these are the defaults for who you can share things with inside that particular site. Now, this is set to anyone, new and existing guest only, and then only people in your organization. So depending on what you're trying to do with the site, you can set this on different levels. But if you remember back at the very beginning when we were looking at the external sharing parts, if you had external sharing turned on and you had external users in your tenant and you allowed folks to share with existing guests, then you would be allowed to share with external users outside of that current security construct. And also, finally, and this is a little bit small here, but the default sharing link type, this is something that we all sort of like collectively grown at, and partly to Mark's point about setting permissions and not creating individual permissions. If we set the default sharing link to people with existing access, that does not create individual permissions on the different items. Whereas if we set it for anything else, specific people or only people in the organization, it's actually going to break inheritance and create individual permissions on each and every item.
More on that later a little bit,
Yep.
but sharing at the site level now.
And yes, in the section
wait,
of
there's more.
One more ring of hell.
One more ring of hell. And this is not accessible anywhere other than here. You actually have to go into the site, go to the gear, and under site permissions, there's yet another hidden link that says change how members can share. And this setting basically says who and how people can share inside this. Who can share and how they can share. Now, depending on what your use case is, I had a client that wanted to not allow anyone to share anything unless they were specifically a member of this group. And by doing that, I set it to only site owners, and they had a very limited group of people that could share that. This is also, I believe, the only place where you can turn on and off allow access requests in Modern. And I'm done pulling on this thread.
Oh, we missed something though.
I'm
that
sure
there's
we
something
did.
else that.
Oh,
yeah.
goodness. Yeah.
I didn't
Yeah.
even talk about Teams.
Yeah, and we haven't talked about guests, but more on that later. Okay, over to Todd to talk about restricted access control. And I think this is one of those things that, depending on your organization, this is why this is sort of under that premium SKU, and it's the next level of hell, but it's not in the out of the box. So whatever.
Yeah, you have to pay for this level of hell.
You have to pay for this level of hell, exactly.
So this is the ability. So this is something that you set at the SharePoint tenant side, not the site side. And that distinction is important here in a minute. Where you can restrict access to a site to people in a specific group in Entra ID. So that can be a security group, or it can be a Microsoft 365 group. And basically what this means is, no matter if the site owner has added somebody to the member or the owner list inside of the site itself, if they're not in the group that has been set at the tenant level, they can't get in. So a good example for something like this is, Mark was talking earlier about how people get added to stuff they shouldn't get added to. This is a way to prevent that. So for instance, we could have a bunch of different IT project sites, and we could have an overarching IT group and say only people in the IT group can be added to any of these projects. Only add the people that are working on the project, but you can't add somebody from accounting, you can't add somebody from engineering or something like that. Only people from the IT group. And you can see in here in the dialog box, there's a thing that says to the site owner. So at the owner level, it says you can't add people if they're not in this group. And if they try to add them, they'll get an error message that says you can't add Derek because he's not in the marketing team or whatever. This can also restrict who you share files to. So remember, this is a site access setting. It can also restrict who you can share files to, but that's not turned on by default, which I kind of disagree with. I think it should be an overarching thing, but it's not. So you can share an individual file with somebody that's not in one of those groups. If you want to shut that off also, I know I promised I wouldn't say the P word, but the only way that I know to restrict the sharing is to use PowerShell. And Greg mentions a thing in here about permissions and Copilot and all that. An interesting thing about this is, if somebody has been added to this site, and I'm not sure how that would work because you can't add them, so maybe if you do it later. But if they have access to something, they've been given access to something, but they can't get through it because of the restricted access control, the documentation says it will show up in search for them, but they just can't get to it. So that would also, if they tried to open it, then they would get an error message that said they didn't have access.
It's kind of a broken promise type of setting situation. Yeah.
And when I was reading that, I was trying to think to myself, how would you get in that situation? Because you can't add somebody if they're not in the group.
Probably they were in there before, and then you turned restricted access on, so they weren't removed, right? You didn't clean up after yourself after the fact. I think that's probably how that situation would happen.
That was the only scenario I could come up with. So again, this is a SharePoint tenant setting. So this supersedes anything you do at the site. And you can use this on group connected sites or non-group connected sites too.
Oh, good to know.
Yeah. So
all right.
Just another way people could maybe not get in. Just another.
We have a couple of tidbits here. One of them is pointing back to that anyone in this organization links that Derek covered. So this one is we said that anyone with existing access was probably the preferred sharing default for your sharing links because it doesn't punch holes in permissions. Unfortunately, at the SharePoint admin level setting, that is not one of your options still. So you have to do that site by site, which is, I suspect people are not then doing that, and thereby you're getting a lot of broken links in sites just because somebody didn't know to go through that extra step every time a site is created. Granted, if you use a provisioning service like from ShareGate or Orchestra or some other thing, it is, well, in the case of ShareGate and Orchestra, they're copying that setting, but in that other case, it might be being copied for you, so it might be being handled. But if you're just having the user go create the sites, that's probably not happening, and we strongly believe it's probably the correct default given how it sort of changes the permission structure and breaks the permissions and creates that permission mix-up. Anything else?
Well, so one thing about that, anyone in this organization link, and this was something that Mark mentioned during our discussion, is I had always thought that was kind of like the everyone link, like you just sent the link out and anybody who clicked on it could get in because everybody had access. But in reality, when they click that link, it doesn't take them to the file or the site. It takes them to a process that gives them permission to the site or the file and then lets them in. So it is a more restricted, and that made a whole lot more sense because I couldn't figure out why we had both of those options before, but now this makes sense. So it only pokes holes in if the person clicks that link, then they're added.
So those anyone in this organization links are not as scary as people think they are, because unless that person actually gets access to that link and follows it, do they get added to the sort of mini membership of that link's access?
Yeah.
So, I can do anyone in this organization link, send it to Todd, he clicks on it. Now Todd has that permission. But if he doesn't send it to anyone else, he's the only person who has that access. I always thought it meant like Todd did. It gives access to everyone just off the bat. And so that's especially in the context of Copilot, that's actually sort of
and
comforting. And
yes.
Same thing.
Exactly.
That's almost a little bit comforting in that it's only happened. Like if you had that link on an intranet page and everyone was clicking on it, then they would get permissions and you would have, 1 million people listed underneath that particular link.
Yeah. The other thing that I wanted to mention is something we don't really think about, but for those of us who came from the old school, like NTFS permissions and all that kind of stuff, it's important to remember that there is no deny in SharePoint. There is no way to prevent somebody from having access to something. All you can do is just not give them access to it. So, earlier Mark mentioned only give permission to people that you think need to have it. Don't put people in groups where they shouldn't be. This is because there is no way to lock them out once you do that. There is no deny.
Yeah, the only maybe exception, it has nothing to do with what we're talking about here, but if you're doing federated users, you can exclude domains from guest users, but we could sort of address that when we talk about guest users later.
Yeah.
But that very niche, not really meaning deny, but you can exclude domains.
Yeah, you can't say everyone in Sympraxis has access except Julie.
Right.
Yeah.
That doesn't
Exactly.
work.
Yeah, 100%. All right, so we go ahead. No, go.
I was just going to do one more thing. So all the sharing settings that I put out there, the one thing, they will prevent you from doing the things that are not allowed. However, like if you need to have access. However, as Mark's like going like this, it does not stop anybody from sharing, like copying the link and sending it to their grandmother, like through email or through instant message. So those people will get access denied errors. But they won't necessarily, unless they have permission, they won't be able to get access.
All right, so we have some links for resources. You should be able to click on them if you're out in the wide world, and will obviously be part of the YouTube episode later when it's published, and also the page on our website where we summarize all our Ask Sympraxis episodes, so you can find them there. Coming up, November 13th, we're going to keep going. We originally had a outline for this session that included guest users and realized quickly that we would not have enough time. So we have moved guest users to the next episode. I sadly will not be here for that, but I'm sure my faithful Sympraxians will cover it thoroughly for everyone. CS Live, reason I won't be here is I will be at TechCon 365 in Dallas. That is November 11th through 15th. If you're going to be there, please say hi to me. ESPC is happening early December. Mark, Derek, and Patrick are all going to be there, so say hi to them if you are there. Community Days Miami is happening in early February. That is Emily Mancini's event down there in Miami, and Mark and I will be joining her. And then hot off the presses, Derek and Mark and I will all be at European Collaboration Summit in Dusseldorf in May. So We're all excited to be doing that event again this year. So say hi to us if you're going to any of those things. And we will see you next time, November 13th, for guest users in Microsoft 365. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Have a great one.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on Ask Sympraxis. We love getting your questions or session ideas. You can submit by using the link in About. If you find this helpful, hit that like or subscribe button and share this content with your colleagues.